256, turn 0106 for my one right, cleared for takeoff.
One right, clear to go, United 25.
Clear 4461, one right, line up and wait.
Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of FlightCast, the Infinite Flight podcast. I'm your host, Jason Rosewell, and this is a show where we put on our pretend aviators, grab a juice box, slip into a Snuggie, and chat about our favorite flight simulator, Infinite Flight. If you're a flying or flight sim enthusiast, but you've never heard of Infinite Flight, head over to the App Store on your iOS device or Google Play for Android and search for Infinite Flight. Today we're going to continue our real-life pilot series with part 3. My next guest is a first officer for a major U.S. airline. He's joining us today on layover in Montana, Jared Hodge. Jared, welcome and thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks, Jason. It's definitely a pleasure and, if I may say, an honor to be here with you. I appreciate you having me on.
Oh, well, thank you. Happy holidays. How's your Christmas been?
Hey, thanks, and happy holidays to you, too. Yeah, it went well. Holiday weekend, I actually had the days off. I had Christmas Eve and Christmas off, and I was actually able to spend it with my family, so it was definitely a plus.
Awesome. That's great. So if we don't mind me diving right into one of my questions, it has to do with the holidays. How do major holidays work with the airline that you work for? Does seniority play into it when you're able to get time off?
Yeah, actually, seniority is actually everything, is what we kind of say, because the more senior you are, you're able to actually, we call it bidding or choosing those days off. So if you want Christmas off and you're senior, you can actually hold it off. Usually, if you're junior, it's difficult to get those major holidays off. So seniority is a big factor in getting that day off.
So you've heard me mention my friend who flies for Air Canada Rouge before. He's
Yes.
talked about bidding with me as well, and actually when I flew to Jamaica, he bid on that flight and didn't get it. So do you try to bid for certain locations as well, or how does that work?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So for me, bidding, I actually commute to my base, and so the trips that I choose, it factors in how long of the trip is. Is it a 4-day trip or a 5-day trip? And is it commutable? And what that means is I can actually fly up there to my base that morning and be able to start the trip. It has a later sign in. So I may sign in at 4 o'clock in the afternoon besides 6 a.m. in the morning, and vice versa at the end of the trip. But there are some areas I like to go to, mostly West Coast. And so I'll try to choose a lot of West Coast trips.
Okay, that's what I'd be doing too.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So,
in warm places during the winter too, if I may add that too.
Yes, for sure. Can you give us an approximate, like a region that you're based out of, or like how long is your commute?
Yeah. Oh yeah, no, yeah. So I'm based in New York, and I live in Atlanta, Georgia. So the flight from Atlanta to New York's approximately an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, depending on headwind and tailwind. So that's where I commute to, and that's where I'm based up in New York.
Okay, right on.
Yeah.
So you're our second airline pilot to visit FlightCast. Of course, we had your fellow Airbus pilot Arnaud with us on episode 4, which was I was just you and I were talking before the episode started, and I mentioned Arnaud's episode is still the one with the highest number of listens.
So are you saying I got to beat that? You're giving me a challenge here?
Yeah, no pressure. No
Okay.
pressure. We'll do our best.
Sounds good.
So, but before we get into too many pilot questions, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. So if you don't know, my name's Jared, and my hometown where I grew up is actually in Mobile, Alabama, home of, I believe, Skyhawk Heavy.
Home of Skyhawk Heavy, yes.
Yeah. So it's funny getting in touch with him. We had a lot in common. I think we knew a lot of people, the same individuals. But
that's awesome.
Yeah, so I'm from Mobile, and I have always had a passion for aviation growing up. It kind of started with this movie that was made back in the 80s called Top Gun. I don't know if anybody's familiar with it, but yeah.
I've heard of it.
So there you go. So that kind of set the fire, brought my interest in. I do owe a lot to my grandfather. He was an enthusiast. He wasn't a pilot. And every time we visited him, he would always talk about flying. My dad actually was in the military. He he served in the United States Coast Guard. He was not a pilot either, but he had a lot of pilot friends. And so he would take me to air shows, and we would also go to there's a training base the pilots do their training in the Coast Guard in Mobile. So he would take us there. We would get in helicopters, sit in the cockpit of a lot of the planes, and it was just constantly owe a lot to my parents and my grandfather for exposing me, if you will, to aviation. So when it came to going to college or university, I knew I wanted to fly, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to go military or if I wanted to fly commercial. And luckily, one of my dad's friends, who's a pilot, he told me about this school that had an aviation program, and you can get a degree in aviation. They teach you how to fly, and it's just a regular school. And so when visited, fell in love with the program. And so that's where I learned to fly. It was at Auburn University in Alabama. And so they taught me how to fly, got all my ratings there. And from there, it was just building my time. I was a flight instructor for a couple of years, built my experience there, learned quite a bit about teaching itself and just communicating with other people. And also exposing them to this passion that I had called flying. From there, not to get too detailed, but I was in the right place at the right time, and someone asked if I was interested in flying their Cessna Citation for them. And so this company that this individual had, we had 6 Citation 2s, Citation 2, private jet. Flew that for about a year and a half, and built my time up there, and got on with a regional airline. So that's we flew CRJ 200, 700s, the Canadian regional jet. I'm sure many are familiar with, and did that for a while, and made it to where I'm at now. So just progressed, build my time, and kind of pay my dues, if you will, to get to where I'm at.
That sounds like a nice little kind of series of steps getting to where you are now. Sounds like you've done everything. Did you start, when you say you started and you got all your ratings in school, does that mean you started with a private license?
That's correct. Yeah. So my first year when I was a freshman, our program was saturated, if you will, with a lot of students. So I was put on a wait list, and that wait list took through my entire freshman year. So I had to go back to Mobile and learn to fly, or get my private pilot, before I came back my second year started. Yeah. So I did my private pilot in Mobile in a 150. And when I came back to school the following year, that's when I started my instrument, commercial, and multi-engine rating training.
Okay, got it. Yeah. Awesome. Well, I think you're describing the path that a lot of us would love to take.
Yeah, I would suggest it greatly, probably stringently, because going to an aviation college, or it's called you have different schools, like you have a Part 61 and a Part 141. A Part 141 school follows a strict syllabus that the FAA approves. So, and usually a Part 141 flight school, their syllabus teaches you how, it's kind of like if you will, an airline training, like you're following a syllabus. There's ways that they teach you to fly, and you have to go through different stages to get to where you want to be. And I personally, and this is only just for me, I mean, I would suggest anyone who's wanting to learn to fly to go to maybe a Part 141 school, or like an aviation academy, because I believe it structures your flight training out well, and you know what's coming up ahead.
Do you think there's something to be said for experience, having more experience one way or the other? Like, it sounds like getting a job with an airline these days can be actually go by fairly quickly. Like, it sounds like airlines are hiring people and then sending them to get their training and then coming back, and then you're flying jets. So I always thought, everyone gets in an airplane, they like to see some gray hair with when they see the captain. Correct. That kind of just says, "Ooh, that guy's got lots of experience," or that lady's got lots of experience. That just seems to be more comfortable for me when I'm getting on an airplane, as opposed to seeing, some two people who are quite young in the cockpit. So, do you have a comment on that at all?
Yeah, actually, I think I could attest that, because when I was flying that for a regional airline, I would always get looks
Right.
from people. I mean, I'll admit, people thought I was an 18-year-old when flying this jet with 70 plus people in the back, um, eh, and that's becoming more common, if you will. I don't think that necessarily just the way the individual looks that equals their experience. I believe that the training that that person gets is very important, especially the training that they get with the airline that they're flying. But I can reassure you that the majority of airlines, because the FAA has been so hard on airline training and have been actually looking at the training that's being given to pilots, that the airlines, you can feel comfortable with when you're getting on an airline that the crew is a well trained crew.
Okay, and especially the airline that you fly for.
Yes,
Which,
yes.
we
And if I may add too,
Sure.
because my airline, you hear about if you fly on a regional airline or a commuter airline, if you will, that flies for a major airline. There's a lot of how do I say? There's a lot of criteria that a major airline puts on other airlines, even co-chairs, if they want to be able to be a part of either flying for that airline or being a co-chair for the airline. So they just don't choose anybody. And if the airline that, like for instance, an airline that wants a co-chair for the for the airline that I fly for, if there's some issues with training or some issues that our airline sees, they'll make recommendations to change it before they even fly for us.
Can you explain co-chair? Is that like a Star Alliance or something?
Exactly. Okay. So, so like Star Alliance, Sky Team, I know there's many others. One World, exactly. So they just don't choose anyone.
Right. Okay.
There's some criteria that have to be met for you to be a part of that group. So hopefully that'll give everyone else another reassurance that you're in good hands. They're just not letting anyone up there.
Right. Okay. Well, as we did with Arnaud, we're going to keep your airline a secret if people can't tell by now. But like I asked him, what does a typical day in your life as a pilot look like? And, if you want to leave out any airline specific details, please feel free to do that.
Very good. Yeah. So I'll put in difference. For instance, the first day I actually check in for a flight compared to I'm already on the rotation and actually flying. So for instance, like when I started the trip that I'm currently on, weather played a factor with me getting into New York, because there was a little bit of convective activity, also thunderstorms, and they were having some weather. So I actually had to pre-plan ahead and get on an earlier flight. So my sign-in was at 8 o'clock at night. So I actually had to fly in a little earlier to be able to make my flight. The one thing that a commuting pilot does not want to have happen is he or she is trying to fly to their base and they can't get up there because of weather.
Right.
It draws a big disruption in the operation, and it's frowned upon. In that case, a pilot is what we call rerouted. So another pilot who's flying a flight would get taken off that flight and put on, say, my flight to come to where I'm at now. And then it's a rolling effect, because then they have to find someone that they took off that flight to replace it.
And so another option that the airline would have is to utilize what we call a reserve pilot. So there's usually a group of pilots that the airline has that they can call, and they would have to come to the airport and cover that flight that a commuting pilot that missed.
Okay, so
that didn't make their flight.
Those would be pilots that live in that city, presumably.
Yes, they would be either at the airport or they live in the city. So usually so they would have to show up a short notice. Okay. If that makes sense.
Would you be a reserve pilot in Atlanta, where you live?
I would be close to being a reserve pilot. So, so that's one reason why my base is in New York, because I'm actually a fairly senior pilot in New York, believe it or not.
Okay. So you've planned ahead, you've got you've made it to your airport, and then what?
Yeah. So from there, it's a matter of just preparing for the flight the flight or flights that you're going to be doing. So if you're going into an airport, we call this like a special airport. If it's in a mountainous area, or there's just some special procedures that you have to abide by, or maybe an airport that you haven't flown into regularly, usually I just look over the approach charts and the approach plates and all the procedures that are going to be required to go into that airport. Usually our report times are an hour before the actual flight. So sometimes I'll meet with the other captain, and we'll just go over a few things, i.e. the route, weather, any other maybe security concerns that might be involved with the flight. But for the most part, usually we do our briefings inside the flight deck when we show up to the airplane. And so because if many who listen to the podcast like to Aeronauts podcasts, sometimes for international flights, you meet well ahead, maybe an hour and a half or so before the flight in a flight planning room. But for domestic that I usually fly, we usually do all our briefings in the flight deck.
Okay.
Yeah, so everything's being prepped. Usually the cabin crew would come into the airplane while the captain and myself are doing the brief, and they have their own briefings going on. But and that's how it is usually for when I'm just getting ready to start a flight. Now, around to when I'm actually on a rotation, for instance, like today, usually if you're laying over in a hotel for a while, sometimes it varies. If you could have little as 11 hours at the city you're staying in, to as great as 50 hours. You could stay somewhere for 2 days. And, when you're there for more than, I'll say maybe more than 16 hours at the actual city, you have time to actually maybe go out and venture and see what is around. But there are times where you just don't have the time to do that, and you find yourself just getting a good night's rest before your next flight the following day.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so then you're off on your voyage, and then what in the flight deck? I mean, we learned a lot from our note, obviously, on what goes on in the flight deck. You're always planning for emergency situations and things that are unexpected. Do you find that when you're flying, is there any downtime at all?
There is yeah, you do find yourself, depending again on the distance and the time your flight time. For domestic flights, I mean, the longest that I probably find myself doing is maybe 4.5, 5 hours max, maybe going East Coast to West Coast. But a lot of the other flights that I'm doing, they're not more than 2 hours.
Okay.
So in that span, when you're at your cruise, you're maybe in cruise for maybe an hour, but you're monitoring your fuel while you're along the way. And again, also making sure all of your the parameters for the plane are normal, and there are a few checks that we do in cruise, making sure that everything is working correctly on the way. But downtime, it's a little bit, it's a little, but
okay.
not a lot.
Okay. All right. Well, let's get around to talking about infinite flight, since that's what we're here to do, somewhat.
Mm-hmm.
So why don't you tell us, how did you get started playing? And the burning question for, I think, all aviation professionals, whether it's air traffic controllers or pilots, is what makes playing, using a flight sim. Some people call it a game, some people call it a sim. It is a sim, obviously.
Right.
Why do that when you get to fly the real thing every day?
Yeah, and that's another very good question. So just going back, I got started, playing, I won't even say playing, but using a flight simulator, when I was maybe 14 years old. And my dad bought me a computer, an old compact computer, and it had Microsoft Flight Simulator 5.1 on it.
Nice.
And I thought it was the most awesome, amazing thing to use. Of course, the graphics back then can't compare to what's available now, but I played that thing as often as I could. And yeah, there were sometimes I would fly from, I don't know, New York to to like Frankfurt real time and just sit there and just watch the plane slowly get there. And it's funny, I see some comments on forums where other flight simmers are doing that. I'm like, wow, that was definitely me when I was younger. Of course, I couldn't do that now. There's no way I'd be able to do it. But it started from there, and I was always into flight simming. And there was a point where you could actually do the multiplayer, but it was such a big lag that the planes were just kind of ticking on your screen that you were trying to fly with. And it was just neat to be able to see someone else on your screen. But I'll be honest, when I started flying for an airline, I kind of got away from flight simming because if I came home from a trip, the last thing I wanted to do was sit at my computer and kind of just watch.
Yeah.
Trying to stay awake, flying from one place to another.
And that's the assumption that I think a lot of people would make too. That's
true. Right. You're definitely right. And when I with my iPhone, my iPad, or whatnot, one of my buddies was telling me about some of the flight simulator apps that are available. So I was like, well, let me check a few of these out. So there were some others that I was using, and I just wasn't excited about it. I don't know, maybe just the whole application and how it ran, I wasn't happy with it. But a buddy of mine who's actually a pilot at the airline I'm at, he was like, hey man, you have to check out this app called Infinite Flight. And it's a really neat game, and the graphics are great on it, and the planes fly. It's a really good application. So I decided to take a look at it. And when I first used it, I got hooked. And it was just convenient, one, of being able to use it on my phone at the time until I put it on my iPad. But it's convenient and it's simple. A person with zero flight time can actually get on this simulation and fly a plane and actually learn a few things from it. But now with the community being involved, you can get more information from others who just have their private pilot to someone who has their airline transport pilot, and utilize maybe some of their use some of their techniques or advice to how to make it a little more realistic, if you will. Mm-hmm. But it's nice. The one thing I did want to mention was how Infinite Flight uses maps and just the regions, and not the full globe or the world, if you will. So you have the region of San Francisco or Southern California, the region of London, England, and Australia. The places you can fly to, it doesn't take more than an hour, if that. Mm-hmm. I mean, minutes to be able to go from one area to another. And so that's what really kind of has drawn me into using Infinite Flight. And now with the air traffic control, I mean, that just took off and really set the score for me wanting to use it more. And it's really neat. The last is the multiplayer function, and how smooth the aircrafts or the planes are actually flying with you. And it's a fantastic application. I'm more than amazed with how the developers came up with it and all the improvements that they're making on it.
Nice, cool. Well, let's find out what kind of airplane you're flying right now.
Yeah, so I'm actually an Airbus A319, 320, and 321 pilot.
So once you've learned on one, is it all transferable to the others?
It sure is. Okay. It sure is. Yeah. So it's one common type.
What do you have to know if you've just flown the 319 and then your next flight, let's say, I don't know if this happens, but let's say the next flight is on the 321. There's a difference in size there and all of that. Do you change anything? Do you have to know anything different between the other?
Yeah, there are a few differences, as we call it, between all of the fleet, or the aircraft, excuse me. So there's just very little ones. For instance, like the 321, when you are taking off and when you're actually pitching the nose up, we call it rotating. Mm-hmm. And so when you rotate, you're more cautious of the tail, and you want to avoid a tail strike.
Right, of course.
You can't. Yeah, so that compared to the 319, you really don't have that problem, if you will, or have to think about. There's some other little things that you cannot simulate it on infinite flight, but let's see, on the 320, you're limited to the number of, when you use your flight spoilers in flight, you're only limited to so many degrees in the spoilers. However, when you fly 319, you actually have more spoilers available when you use it with the autopilot on.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, flap speeds are different,
Right.
From the different ones. So we have placards, just little notes on the glare shield, or excuse me, the panel, and it'll tell you what the speeds are. Of course, you should know them as being a pilot, but just to kind of back you up, they have them right there in front of you, and you can take a look at it.
Okay.
But besides that, the flight deck looks the same.
Okay. So now you're
really
flying infinite flight, and for the big news recently was this airplane being launched in the sim. So how have you found the flight physics and in terms of compared to other airplanes that you've flown in the sim?
Yeah, and so let me just say that developers that created the airplane did a fantastic job. It's I really am pleased with how the airplane flies. I was actually a little concerned with how much thrust you would need on the jet to maintain a glide slope, because on some of the airplanes I've flown or that I fly on infinite flight, I notice you really need a lot of power to keep the airplane on a glide slope.
Yes.
But this one, they got it right. I mean, they got it right. I mean, there's sometimes you don't have a lot of thrust when you're flying the glide slope. I mean, the wing on the real airplane, the wing is so well designed that it's a slick wing. It's sometimes hard to slow down the airplane, and I find it on infinite flight that's the same. It's the same way. So I'm really pleased with that. But just the handling of the plane, yeah, they did a really good job on it, and it flies pretty close to how it is in a real plane. There's a lot of differences, of course, when you're flying the real plane itself, because I'm sure you're aware, it's a fly-by-wire airplane.
Right.
So you don't really get a lot of feel for it. So, but just plain and simple, yeah, the plane, I've been really happy with how the plane flies in infinite flight.
Awesome. So you mentioned the slick wing design on the 320, and let's just say, for argument's sake, when we say 320, we mean the whole family.
Yes.
And I've noticed, and I've had pilot friends of mine mention that when you're using spoilers, sometimes it can be uncomfortable for the passengers, and it can be a little noisy. So do you find that you've got to use you try not to use your spoilers in flight and your speed brakes?
Yeah, actually, you have to use the speed brakes. You have to use them to be able to slow the airplane down. It's just, or you just find yourself having difficulty either maintaining a speed that maybe air traffic control will give you, or the plane just won't slow down.
Okay.
But yeah, it does get a little noisy, but I don't want people listening to think that it's so noisy that it draws a concern. It's more of a little bit of a rumbling, if you will, kind of. But on this airplane, you just have to use them. Sometimes, believe it or not, you have to actually just put the gear down to get the plane slowed, and you may be at 10,000 feet trying to get lower.
And you're dumping the gear.
You're dumping the gear because the flap speeds are pretty low.
Okay.
And on other airplanes that I have flown, you can actually use your flaps at a higher airspeed.
Okay, so that would be called overspeeding the flaps, right?
That's right. Yeah. So that's one thing you don't want to happen. Don't want to have happen.
Well, you don't like having your flaps ripped off mid-flight?
Well, that, and then on the Airbus, if anything is oversped or you have any type of anomaly, the airplane sends the information to maintenance control. So everyone knows that you overspin the flaps, and then there's a an inspection
And
process.
they're waiting for you on the ground.
And the one thing that's embarrassing is when you're coming to an airport and you're giving the airplane to another crew who's taking that airplane out, and you have to, and they're just sitting there looking at you, seeing what happened.
Because they already know.
They already know. They already know, and you're like, oh, now we're going to be delayed because of you. That's kind of embarrassing, but you know, it hasn't happened to me yet, but I've heard it happen to other people.
Man.
So
yeah. So you've got your cheat sheet in front of you, but you should really be understanding all of those things before you take flight, I would think.
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, cool. that is correct. Mm-hmm.
All right. So keeping with our infinite flight questions, are there any real life procedures or rules that infinite flight pilots can use to make their experience more realistic and successful? I asked this question to Arnaud as well, and I think we talked about charts a little bit, and we've talked in a few episodes about using approach plates and things like that. But any thoughts from you?
Yeah, it's great. I'm glad you said that, because I know he said that. I didn't want to repeat what he was saying, but if you want to, I mean, I've seen it on the forums of doing a reduced thrust takeoff. What we call it at my airline, we call it a flex takeoff. So in the airlines, and pretty much all in commercial, in corporate aviation or anyone that flies jets, you don't take off at 100%.
Right.
Of thrust. And so I would suggest sometimes when I'm controlling, I can hear the engines. I can tell people are doing a full thrust takeoff. But yeah, when you take off, use 95% power. And after you take off, you can actually do what's called an accelerated altitude when you begin to accelerate to 250 knots or whatever speed you want to do. For those who just want to fly maybe a standard profile. So one way to do that is get the field elevation for the airport that you're flying out of, whatever that field elevation, let's just say it's 100 feet. So add 1,000 feet to it. So that's 1,100 feet. So after you take off, our pitch is only maybe 15 to 18 degrees nose up. So while you're holding that 18 degrees at 1,100 feet, lower the nose to maybe 11 degrees and let the airspeed build up and bring the power back again to close to maybe 92%. And it's pretty neat. If you're an enthusiast, you would know what I'm talking about. You may, even when you're flying, you'll hear the engines kind of wind down a little bit after takeoff. Yep. And so what that is the aircraft is reaching what we call an acceleration height. And they're lowering the nose, bringing the power back a little bit more, and accelerating to whatever speed they need to. And what that does in the real world, it saves engine life and prevents a lot of damage to the engine itself. So that's something that I would suggest if you want to make it more realistic is to do that. Okay.
I've actually noticed too that where it seems to me that at some point during a departure or a climb out, when I'm on a commercial flight, that you might level off at 2,000 or 3,000 or 5,000 feet and just fly there for a while. Is that an air traffic control issue?
That is an air traffic control issue.
Okay.
Yeah. Sometimes, and I try to portray that when I'm controlling too, is because you have planes coming into the airport and planes leaving. Sometimes when you take off, you have to level off because there's an airplane above you going into the airport.
Right.
And so that's more of an air traffic control reason.
Okay.
Yeah.
Something that I've wondered too, though, is that if you level off, say you've already retracted your flaps and you're leveling off at 5,000 feet, you still aren't able to go faster than 250 knots because you're below 10,000, right?
That's correct. Mm-hmm.
So since you're going so slow relative to, what you'd be doing at cruise, don't you have to still have the nose pitched up a little bit to maintain altitude at that speed?
Yes.
Since you don't have any flaps?
That's correct. Because you're not going as fast. I try, and one other thing is I try to make things a little more simple. I don't want to get too much into the whole science of aerodynamics and then just lose a few people.
That's for another episode.
That's for another episode. I'm just trying to keep it simple here, sure. But you're totally right. Yeah. flaps produce lift, and so you're actually decreasing a little bit of the lift. And to counteract that, to make it simple, you have to add a little bit of back pressure.
Okay.
Or put the nose up a little bit more to maintain that lift for a steady flight.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
But one thing, if I can add this one too, because I think it will really help everyone in infinite flight community, is flying airspeeds that are a little more realistic. Because I noticed one thing that infinite flight doesn't have is what's called a barber pole, or a max speed. And speeds I've noticed that I've seen, or some people are kind of in an A320 going close to 600 knots,
right,
which is not realistic at all. But some of the speeds, like, we really don't cruise, like at lower altitudes, it's really not more than 300 to 320 knots. And at higher altitudes, when you get into your Mach numbers, it's usually between 0.74 and 0.78. And what that does also is it helps the controllers out sequencing planes in, but it'll also help the pilot out to be able to plan a descent point more effectively too. So that's another thing I would just throw out there too.
Okay, nice. I have so many questions I want to ask you as you're talking, but I want to try and keep this episode to a reasonable length. So we'll save some of those until next time. But so speaking of the A320, I just want to toss a tiny little contest out to everybody listening, and I'm going to play a A320 sound that is specific to Airbus, and we'll see if you guys can guess it. So here it is, and take a listen. The first person to, let's say, the first person to comment on the Facebook post for this episode on the FlightCast page will win something, probably just a high five. But here it is. All right, so there it is, and like I said, if you know what it is, go ahead and comment on the Facebook post on the FlightCast page for this episode. All right, so let's take a few Facebook questions. Speaking of Facebook, if you don't mind, Jared.
No problem. Yeah, definitely.
Okay, so Emil asks, and I apologize if I don't get some of these names right in the pronunciation, but Emil asks, have you ever experienced a serious incident while you've been in the air?
Yes.
Ooh.
And I'll keep it simple and short. So it was Christmas Day a couple of years ago. It was my old airplane that I flew. It wasn't on the Airbus. Anyhow, we departed from Baltimore, and I began to hear a crackling sound. I was like, this does not sound right. And when I turned around and looked in the circuit breaker panel, we ended up having one of the panels were on fire behind the panel, and I could see these little flames shooting out from the panel. So I told the captain, I was like, sir, I think we're on fire.
Just what every captain wants to hear.
Just what he wants to hear. And he looked at me because we didn't get any warnings, and sure enough, the flame went out and our cockpit filled with smoke. So it's funny how training mode went in instantly. So we put on our oxygen masks, and he told me, get us back to Baltimore as soon as possible, while he ran the checklist and talked to the passengers in the back.
Okay, so you're flying at this point?
So I'm flying the airplane. So I pretty much tell the air traffic controller, my call sign and emergency aircraft, we have smoke in the flight deck, need to land immediately. And I'll never forget the controller's voice. She said, turn heading 120, clear to land any runway that you want.
Any airport, any runway.
Anywhere that you want. She was like, you're clear to land any runway. And after I turned the plane around, we were quite high, and I literally had to get the airplane down. And so at this point, I'm just telling myself, fly the airplane, just fly the airplane.
Right.
Because that's where still a lot of people make mistakes, is not flying the airplane. We got on the ground. The smoke began to dissipate after we landed. And the other thing I remember is I brought the plane to a stop, and the captain, we made our PA announcement, but the fire crash and rescue was sitting right there at the flight deck window, just ready to start spraying us down if it needed to. But the fire put itself out. and we went back to the gate. They did something had happened with the electrical system, and it was an electrical fire. But
So
that's just one of
it wasn't affecting any of your instruments or controls?
We had a few of the controls the instruments fail. They were like non-essential instruments, but the primary flight display and everything else was still working. But the circuit breaker itself that had fried, it did what it was supposed to. It took itself offline.
Okay.
And the fire put itself out, but we didn't lose too many.
Okay, so
but that was just one of them.
with a glass cockpit, how are you? What do you do if those instruments? So say the circuit breaker for those displays, blew up. Is there backup power for those, or just in a scenario where those just go black?
Yeah.
What happens?
Yeah, you do have backup power. The instruments itself, they usually run off of one of the engine generators.
Okay.
But the power coming from that. But yeah, let's just say that they stopped working. Yeah, you do have a backup system where you can either bring the displays back up, or you can just use the old school steam gauge standby instrument that's not glass. It's just like what you have in your 172.
Where's that?
So we have that in the airplane too.
Oh, okay.
Believe it or not. Yeah. So it sits in the middle of the control panel,
just waiting to save your bacon.
Look at that. Just waiting to save the bacon. That's well said.
Nice. All right,
but
cool.
we were lucky. Yeah. So that's just one of the other incidents that I've had. Yeah.
Okay, well, we'll leave it at one for now, and we'll maybe get to hear about another one later.
Yeah.
So Liam's wondering, I don't know. This is a personal question. You don't answer it if you don't want to. Does being a commercial pilot pay well for the work that you're doing, do you figure?
Yeah, it's a great job. I love my job. It allows my family it allows me to provide for my family. That's one reason why I wanted to be an airline pilot. It does pay very well. I would be lying if I said it didn't.
Plus, if your boss is listening, you don't want to say the wrong thing.
No, I don't want to say the wrong things. But it's just as the longer you stay at an airline, the more you have the ability to make a better income. So just in the beginning of your year, the airline's more just looking at you to make sure you're on probation, is what we call it. And so your first year pay is usually low, but when you make it past your probation year, the pay increases. So to answer your question, yeah, it does very well. It pays very well.
Okay. So again, I apologize if this pronunciation is wrong, but Hamza wants to know, what is your favorite airport to land at? And I guess we could say, what's your favorite hub to fly into for whatever reason?
Oh, okay. So I would have to actually, I'm going to say New York.
Oh, because that means you're going home then.
Well, yeah, but no, it's flying in and out of New York. It's fun. It's a lot going on. It's challenging, especially when you're doing I would suggest everyone look up the expressway visual to runway 31.
Oh yeah, I've definitely seen that on YouTube.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so that's a fun approach to fly, and you fly it visually. Even leaving out of New York, how the procedure that they have you fly, it's really neat how they have that whole airspace set up. But that's what I'm going to stick with. Right, it's between that. DCA is fairly challenging, but I'm just going to or Washington D.C.
There's a river visual approach in D.C., isn't there?
Yeah, there's the river visual to runway 19, and that's very challenging itself too.
That's awesome because you're turning final very late.
You are. Well, you're avoiding a lot of important government buildings that you're not allowed to fly over.
Right.
One being the president's house, the president of the United States. But
yeah, you don't want to miss your approach into the White House. That's for sure.
No, you don't want to do that. Not at all. So, but that's another challenge, especially when you have a high crosswind, when the wind is actually trying to trying to move you into the direction you don't want to go.
Right.
It can be very challenging. But yeah, to answer the question again, I'm going to just stick with New York because of the 3 airports, and you have to be on your toes going into there.
Okay. So before I ask this next question from Mark,
Great.
No, don't worry, it's a legitimate question.
Okay.
We won't have to bleep anything out.
Okay.
So his question assumes that you had to move from a yoke to a side stick. So were you flying a Boeing before this?
I was, yes.
Okay. And you've mentioned, flying almost everything under the sun from, learning on the 150 up to the Citation at some point, and I'm sure there's been a bunch in between there. So most of those you're on a yoke. So his question is, how different and or difficult was it transitioning from a yoke to a side stick?
And it was not difficult. I thought it would be. My instructor, when I went on the Airbus, told us, give me 5 to 10 minutes and you'll be just fine. And it's it's a lot of, how they explain it, it's like wrist movements, and you fly the airplane with your fingertips. It's very, very responsive. So using the side stick, I like it now. It comes second nature, if you will.
So with flying by wire, does that, like, if you're encountering a really strong crosswind, obviously you're using some rudder there, but are you feeling any resistance on the joystick?
No.
No. Okay.
And Jason, I'm just going to say it because in the Airbus community, it's a side stick.
Oh, what did I say? I said joystick, didn't I?
Yeah.
Oh, I might have to beat that out.
Training. The reason I laugh at it is because I said joystick in training one time, and I still don't hear the last of it. So,
okay.
But you don't get any response, and that was the one thing I had to get used to. That was a little, I wouldn't say difficult, but you just had to wrap your head around that. The computer is controlling a lot of the ailerons and the control surfaces, and you don't know it. But you have to, so sometimes the plane may feel like it's unstable, and they've taught us to sometimes be like, just let go of the side stick a few seconds, and the plane will come back. The computers will get it back to being stable.
Wow, that's got to be a trip.
It was. Oh, when it first, but it's such, in real life, that was in the simulator, but in real life, it's just, it's amazing. It's like, wow, this plane is so stable, and it just takes little fingertip flying to fly in a strong crosswind. But
man,
it does everything.
So many questions I want to ask, but again, in the interest of time, I won't. What I'd like to do, maybe, Jared, is have maybe you and Arnaud and maybe a couple of the other regular guys that I have on, so we can just like chat.
I think that would be beneficial. Not only I think it'd be beneficial for all of us talking, and everyone in the community too. Just to
throw it open to lots more Facebook questions and just talk.
Yeah, just asking questions. Yeah, because you're asking some great questions. So everyone else, and like you said, I wish I could get to all of them. Because they're really good questions.
Cool. Okay, so those are our Facebook questions, and since we're done those, I'm just going to throw it over to Cam for a message about Live Flight App. We'll be right back in a second. Hey Cam, you know what'd be great?
What's that, Jason?
If there was an app I could use along with Infinite Flight. Something I could use to track and share my flights, or check out where the action is before starting some ATC work.
Well, I actually happen to create something that does all of that.
Really?
Really. Head over to liveflightapp.com, where you can track flights in Infinite Flight live in real time, view stats about your flight, and learn more about pilots and controllers around you.
Cam, I have a confession to make. I knew all of that. I was just testing you.
Well, anytime you'd like me to come by for another test, just let me know.
Thanks, Cam. In the meantime, everybody, why don't you head over to liveflightapp.com for your next flight. Now back to the podcast. All right, thanks, Cam. So as we approach the end of the interview here, Jared, I just want to ask one of my favorite questions that I have for all of my guests, and that is, what would you love to see next for Infinite Flight?
Yeah. So I had mentioned earlier in the podcast, I would like, if possibly the developers could include the max speed, a barber pole or a VMO or MMO on all the planes. So I think it would help out quite a bit. Maybe.
So when you see, if I can just interject, when you say barber pole, I'm assuming that it is something, it relates to something visual that you're seeing?
Yeah, so it looks like a checkered board that it comes into view when the plane is beginning to go too fast.
Ah, okay.
And so when you use your flaps, that barber pole will actually show also, so you won't exceed your flap speed.
Ah, okay. Nice.
So, because you could go 300 knots on infinite flight and put your flaps down and nothing happened, right?
Yes.
So
well,
I think,
the nose might pitch up a little
well,
bit. But
well, when I say nothing, right, correct.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, you're
you'll
not going to
get,
break the airplane.
that's right. It's not going to, that's correct. That would be great if they were able to put something in like that. Some of the voice commands from ATC to the pilot or vice versa, clearing a pilot for the visual approach besides
Yes.
maybe getting vectors.
Yeah.
And
Or a straight-in approach maybe for the approach controllers.
for the approach, correct. Yeah, so maybe when a pilot checks on, you're able to, hey, expect vectors for the visual approach to runway 10 left. And so you just vector them close to it and say, hey, do you have the airport in sight? You're clear for the visual approach. You fly it.
Yes,
That's
awesome. Okay.
Yeah, I think that would. And then last, the airspace configuration. I understand they're under a lot of time crunch or whatnot and trying to develop, but I've noticed some of the airspaces aren't correct. And I would like to maybe see some airspace, the configuration of the airspaces developed to help out air traffic controllers and also people flying into the airspace and out of it.
Okay. Can you expand on that a little bit? Like, can you give me an example?
Yeah, sure. So I've noticed, and again, I'm not trying to pick on Infinite Flight. I love it to death.
Oh no.
So,
I'm sure this is the part Matt looks forward to the most.
Yeah. So I've noticed. So when you fly, let's just say an ILS approach, the ILS keeps you in the boundaries of the airspace that prevents you from flying out of, let's say, a Class B airspace. So a Class B airspace has multiple levels, and I've noticed it does have it on Infinite Flight, but the space isn't wide enough, if you will, the diameter of it. And
like when you intercept the ILS, you mean?
Like when you intercept the ILS and when you're flying the ILS down, you're actually leaving the Class B airspace or the Class C airspace.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And now you're in an airspace where you could collide with an airplane flying VFR because it's underneath that shelf. The VFR traffic could be underneath that shelf, but you're on an instrument approach, and it should keep you inside of the airspace at all times.
That should be a safe path for you to
Correct.
land.
So if I'm flying VFR and I'm staying underneath, I'm just going to say Class B airspace. Yeah, if I fly where the glide slope's at, I mean, I could interfere with that plane that's landing, even though I'm not breaking a violation, or excuse me, I'm not violating the airspace. I think it could cause a problem. But that's one, especially when controlling, the planes that are coming into to an airport. In the States and other countries, they change the shape of the airspace to fit more planes into that airport's airspace. And they either make it wider or they draw a corridor to let planes come in to stay in the confined area of the airspace. So
okay.
all airports are different. That's why I'm sure they probably use a standard airspace draw and layout and altitude wise. But for places like Los Angeles or Singapore or Sydney, I think it should be drawn out a little bit better.
Okay, yeah, that'd be even if the functionality was built in, and then a team of airport editors who knew what they were doing could go in and put in that data. That would be really cool.
That would be really cool. And so I think it would relieve some of the headaches that some controllers have when they see a VFR airplane flying underneath the airspace. Sometimes I so want to tell that person to contact me, but he doesn't have to.
Right.
So that's it.
Well, and I think a lot of us, including myself, who don't understand airspace as well as you and other pilots do, we look at it very one-dimensionally. So I see a circle or a couple circles, and that's my airspace, right? I'm not thinking vertical.
Correct.
So yeah, so I mean I understand that if you're transitioning at 10,000 feet, you're not in my airspace. but for aircraft below that, I've never even thought about that.
That's right. So just because I know I'm not the only commercial or pilot on Infinite Flight or whatnot, and so I'm sure there are others who have, or I know that there are others that have mentioned that to me. So that's something I would just maybe look into. But those would be things I think that would relieve a lot of the headaches sometimes, or that some people may experience when flying on the ATC server, and vice versa, or controlling on the ATC server also. Okay.
All right. Well, I think that's going to be it, Jared. Do you have anything else you want to add before, or let our listeners know about?
No, yeah. So just to the listeners, I appreciate everyone that flies on the Infinite Flight server. Thank you. And also thank you to yourself, Jason, for doing this podcast. I think it's a great opportunity for others to learn and to gain more knowledge about aviation, because there's so much there. I'm still learning myself. And so hopefully what you're doing will just spark that interest in someone to learn more about aviation and get involved into it. If you're just an enthusiast or you want to do it for a career, but I just want to thank everyone that flies on the server. We're all doing a great job. So
cool. Well, thanks to you for your work on the air traffic side on the advanced server, and thank you for spending some of your downtime when you're on the road with us.
It was my pleasure.
Well, thanks for listening. If you haven't already, head over to the App Store or Google Play and download Infinite Flight. For more FlightCast, visit flightcast.audio. We would also love it if you would subscribe to the podcast and review it on iTunes. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/FlightCastAudio and on Twitter at FlightCastAudio. If you have any ideas for FlightCast, please leave them in the comments. FlightCast is brought to you by Linkhouse Media on the web at linkhousemedia.com. Podcasting takes time and money, so if you have a few extra bucks, we'd love it if you would consider donating to help keep us going strong. To donate, visit flightcast.audio and click on the yellow PayPal button in the sidebar. To cover the fine print, FlightCast is not affiliated with Infinite Flight or Flying Development Studio. I'm Jason Rosewell. Thanks for listening, and happy landings.